Okay, well, Matthew, would you like to take over and start your talk on the topographic and climatic controls on post-fire planted seedling establishment?
Sure, thanks, David. All right, I'd like to thank David and Jeff for the invitation to talk to you today about some work we've been doing in the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. And so before I get going, I just want to acknowledge Chris Marsh, Joe Crockett, and Dan Krofchek. Chris and Joe are current lab members, and Dan did a postdoc with me and is now at Sandia, but these folks have been pretty heavily involved in this analysis. You know, as everyone in this session knows, we've got increasing area burned in the Southwest over the last 4 decades. Starting in the 70s, Leroy Westerling's analysis shows about a 462% increase in the area of large forest fires. And then some other work shows that high severity fire is increasing as well, right? So we've got more extreme weather conditions. We've got a fuels condition issue from, you know, a century or more of fire exclusion. And then, you know, all that's interacting with just an aridifying climate here in the Southwest. And, you know, the picture is pretty bleak going forward if we think about increasing temperature, its influence on area burned, and then as Kim Davis's results showed early on in this session, some pretty significant impacts in terms of tree regeneration for the Southwest. And so, you know, all of these things come together and get realized across space. You know, Kim's results were analyzing the effects of climate at a 4-kilometer scale. These results from Jesse Utz looked at several different fires across the Southwest, both in Arizona and New Mexico, and found, you know, a wide range of outcomes in terms of planted and unplanted seedling survival. And so from a natural regeneration perspective, it ranged from 0 to about 70% survival. And you know, with about a 25% mean, so highly variable. So, you know, all of this stuff is really kind of piqued my interest when I first moved to New Mexico in 2015. I went out in the field with Craig Allen into the footprint of the Las Conchas fire, which burned in 2011. About 30% of the area burned at high severity. So the Las Conchas fire interacted with a number of other fire footprints. Following this wildfire event, there was a significant amount of post-fire erosion and then really low post-fire seedling survival. And this is both in terms of natural regeneration, so particularly kind of in mid-elevation range where it was ponderosa pine beforehand, and also for planted seedling survival. There's been relatively low survival across this fire footprint. And so, you know, when you go out into what used to be forested, it kind of looks like this now. There's large swaths of what was burned by high severity, where there's nary a live tree. And this is, you know, we're kind of in the juniper pinon area, looking up into the ponderosa pine area in the background. And so in 2016, we initiated a study funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. And the objective was to try and understand how planted seedling survival would do under a range of conditions across this burn footprint. And so we planted out 4 species and we stratified those plantings based on more northerly versus southerly facing aspects. We were thinking about this as we set up the experiment in terms of you know, conditions that might help facilitate planted seedling establishment. So we planted under New Mexico locust as well as out in the open on both of these aspects. And so the 4 species we planted were ponderosa pine, pinon, Douglas fir, and southwestern white pine, all of which occurred in the area before the Las Conchas fire. And then we did, you know, basically across these, you know, what we're calling 10 plots, but it was basically 10 areas spread across an elevation gradient where we planted these kind of grouped based on condition so that we could, tackle a number of different measurements. And so if you're looking out at the Las Conchas fire footprint, in each of these 10 planting areas, we set up weather stations where we measured a range of meteorological conditions, including soil temperature and moisture. We have these kind of 2-wire exclosures we put up just to keep the elk from munching on our seedlings, and then put Vexar over them. But you can see, the post-fire environment, some pretty healthy regrowth of some of the shrubs. And then, we planted out, where we planted seedlings, we put out eye buttons to measure temperature and relative humidity at seedling height. And this was Gen 1 of our little solar shields here, non-aspirated, to kind of measure temperature and relative humidity at seedling height on 30-minute intervals during the growing season. And so, and then we flew the area with UAV so that we could get high resolution imagery in order to model things like microclimate and variability in terms of topography and the like. So I'm going to present to you a couple of different pieces of this study today. And the first is just getting into the actual planted seedling survival data. And that is, when we just bin these things up categorically and look at survival, so on the y-axis, I've got number survived here, and on the x-axis aspect, so more northerly versus more southerly. The gray bars are out in the open, the yellow bars are under locust, and then we've got pinon pine, ponderosa pine, southwestern white, and Doug fir. And the punchline of this is that mean survival was about 10 to 40%, depending on species, some variability in aspect, little variability in terms of under locust versus out in the open. But the kind of binning of these characteristics don't do a good job of representing the experience that these seedlings are having out in the environment. And so what we wanted to do was look at these variables along continuous axes. And so thinking about the factors that influence what the climate is that a seedling experiences, we decided to take a look at topographic factors. So we used elevation, aspect, and slope data, modeled solar radiation. We have some topographical indices such as the topographic wetness index, heat load index, topographic position index, etc. And then some microclimatic variables to model seedling survival or mortality. And so the results I'm going to show you first here are from piecewise exponential models, where we modeled hazard as a function of topographic variables and also microclimatic variables. Just to get us oriented here, we've got pinon pine, ponderosa pine, southwestern white, and Doug fir. The blue arrows are drawing your attention to variables that had a positive impact on, a negative impact on survival, or a positive impact on mortality. And then the yellow variables are ones that had a positive, misspoke again. I had that inverted here. So basically, when we've got blue, we're things that decrease decrease mortality, and when I've got yellow, it's things that increased mortality. And so basically, I'm drawing, focusing in on ponderosa pine here. We see topographic wetness index and roughness index both led to decreased mortality, and a similar thing for southwestern white pine and Doug fir. Pinyon pine was kind of one of those kids that was doing its own thing the whole time. Heat load, we saw, for ponderosa, Doug fir, and southwestern white, as well as pinon, as heat load increased, we saw an increase in mortality. And then with the microclimatic variables, it's really all about basically dryness, in particular mean and max VPD, vapor pressure deficit, in the spring and summer. Were really impactful in terms of increasing mortality for these different species. So then we decided to take this information, and the idea being that we could use the understanding we had gained from this planted seedling experiment to try and model where on the landscape we're likely to find locations that are going to have a higher probability of seedling survival. And so to do this, we decided to just zero in on ponderosa pine, which is the most commonly planted species in these post-fire environments. And we also decided to focus our attention on the state variables of the system by and large, so things related to topography, and then also modeled solar radiation. And so we built these models in using boosted regression trees, so a machine learning approach where we could assimilate the information and then also assimilate new data into the models and make updated predictions. And so I'll show you the range of outcomes here briefly. So built models with everything from seedling survival to elevation, slope aspect, and the like. So those topographic positions, and then make predictions across the landscape, right? And so, we've got area. So basically this model with seedling survival, elevation, and these other topographic factors explains about 64% of the variability in the landscape. One of the things that caught our attention in this, though, is this so basically, as we get up in a higher elevation, we tend to find really high seedling survival probabilities for ponderosa pine. And one of the things that gave us pause in this is that, basically we're starting to get beyond the empirical data underlying this. We did not have planted seedlings up at those highest elevations. And so the model was reacting to the highest elevation plot we had, and also to the fact that we have some underlying or some Forest Service planted seedling survival data that we used for validation, and then assimilated those data, and those all tended toward the lower end of the range of our planted seedling survival data. So we ran models that excluded elevation. You see we get a change in the amount of the variability explained. And then we included ones where we have solar radiation in January, February, and the like, and make predictions based on that. We see roughly the same area under the curve, about 65, 63%. And then basically we roll all these models up into a model of models. And what that allows us to do is, basically kind of make a prediction across space as a function of all these variabilities, and weight the models according to their predictive power. And so, what we find is that we get some percentage of that variability explained by different factors, like the topography and solar radiation, right? We get about 73% of the variability in this model of models explained by that model. And you see that march on down through. And then basically we're able to capture about 90% of the variability across the landscape in terms of planted seedling survival. And so you can think about this in terms of, if we want to focus our attention in places where we're likely to have seedlings survive for, with a higher probability of survival, which is probably a good choice given that it costs, $500 to $1,000 an acre to plant. And we're seeing, planted seedling survival ranges of like 0 to 70%. We can use this, kind of model of models to make a prediction, and then identify places on the landscape where we've got a high probability of survival. And so basically all I've got here is the frequency distribution of these grid cells, which are 1 meter by probability of survival. You see a huge chunk of the landscape's unlikely to support seedlings. There's kind of some areas here in the middle probability ranges where we've got, a decent amount of the landscape, where we've got kind of a 50-50 split and whether or not the seedling lives or dies. And then a much smaller fraction of the landscape where we've got a higher probability of survival. And so we have the potential to use that information to inform where we put seedlings back on the landscape, so we can focus our attention where we're likely to be most successful. And so this is really the precursor to a project that we're about to initiate where, we just had a USDA proposal funded where we're going to plant across a wider elevation range. So the idea is we want to solve some of that issue that we saw with a high probability predicted at higher elevations by planting, as high as like 9,500 feet to 10,000 feet in elevation. We're going to plant across a wider range of sites throughout northern New Mexico, focus exclusively on ponderosa pine, plant 10,000 or so seedlings. And then we're going to use a lot more sensors to measure more of the microclimatic variables at seedling height. So the idea being that we want to get some of these micromet variables at seedling height and then also measure soil moisture around more of the seedling positions. And we're also planning to fly these new experimental areas to obtain with UAVs to obtain thermal imagery so we can better model the variability in that thermal environment across space. We'll then roll all this information up to make a prediction across the state to identify areas where we're likely to see high probability of planted seedling survival. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge collaborators and funding. This work was funded by both the Joint Fire Science Program and also USDA NIFA. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Matt. Yeah, please. We have 2 minutes, a little over 2 minutes for questions. And back from the void. Sorry for missing out early. Any questions?
Hi,
No
hi,
questions.
this is Jen Baltzer. Hi, Matt. Thanks for the great talk. This is a bit of a naive question, maybe because I'm not super familiar with the system you work in, but does seeding, would aerial seeding not work at all? I understand you're trying to give them a bump up by planting bigger seedlings, but does seeding work in this system?
Yeah, not especially well. Basically, it turns into a rodent buffet if you seed.
Gotcha.
Hi, Matt. This is Pepe Iniguez. I had a quick question. If I understand it correctly, the idea is to plant where the seedlings are most likely to take and grow up. But the model shows that most of the landscape does not support ponderosa pine again. So in the end, I'm not sure what those trees are going to do because the rest of the landscape can't support it.
So I think, that's an important distinction to make, Pepe, is that it's not that the model shows most of the landscape won't support ponderosa pine. It's that most of the landscape won't support ponderosa pine seedlings, right? And the real thing that's constraining these predictions is that in the second year of the planting experiment, we had a significant winter drought. And so, it was anomalously dry. I guess not anomalously dry if you just look at the last 5 or 10 years, but it was super dry and we had a lot of mortality. And so I think the neat thing about this is that where the model predicts a high probability of planted seedling survival are areas where the microclimate is somewhat disconnected from the local or even regional climate, in that you've got some level of protection against these extreme drought events. And so thinking about it as these landscape positions where we can reestablish seedlings, conifer seedlings after high severity wildfire, you can think about it in as kind of the potential to create a seed island. And then as those individuals grow to maturity, they're going to start to modify the microclimate around it some too. And it may help slow the rate of change on these landscapes over time.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jen and Pepe, for questions. We're going to move on to the next speaker. Tara, if you can please queue up your slides. And while she's doing that, I'll just introduce Tara Ursell from the University of California, Davis. She's going to talk about the contribution of planted trees to tree regeneration in the Western Sierra Nevada of California. Take it away, take it away, Tara.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, awesome. And that last question was a great segue to my topic. So yeah, again, I'm Tara Ursell. I'm a PhD student at UC Davis. I study forest ecology and management. And today I'm presenting this work along with my advisor, Hugh Safford. And I'd also like to start off by thanking Jeff and David for inviting me to give this presentation. And I'd also like to note that this work was funded by CAL FIRE via the California Climate Investments Program. Okay. So now that Matt has discussed some of the drivers and constraints influencing the viability of tree planting for forest recovery, I'm going to discuss whether strategically planting trees can lead to broader forest recovery in the long term. And my interest in this question partially comes from a kind of general awareness of the idea of nucleation in the restoration literature. Nucleation is this idea that early arriving or remnant individuals after disturbance can serve as focal points for regeneration and stimulate some sort of recovery or successional process. And this can happen through a variety of mechanisms, whether it's attracting dispersers or modifying the environment to alleviate stressful conditions, or simply by serving as seed sources in their own right. So in a restoration and recovery context, a nucleation strategy would be to manually place those nuclei, such as by planting them. And clearly this has cost-saving implications, as it implies that only a fraction of the landscape needs to be planted in order to have broader impacts. The idea has been tested in many other ecological contexts to see whether it's possible to get a greater bang for your buck when it comes to funding restoration or reforestation. So I'm mentioning 3 cases here just to give you an idea of the variety of ecosystems in which nucleation has been investigated. And as you can see, the question has spans like a variety of land cover types and land use histories. But of course, this is AFI, and we were interested in looking at the strategy in the context of post-wildfire management. And not just due to some theoretical interest from the literature, but also because it's been proposed as a land management strategy for forest recovery in the Western United States. So a while back, a review led by Malcolm North proposed a 3-zone approach to reforestation, post-fire reforestation. In the first zone, don't plant in areas adjacent to unburned or surviving pockets of trees because natural regeneration is likely. Second zone, do plant trees in areas that are accessible and safe and where natural regeneration is unlikely. And third zone, most important for the study, plant small stands of trees in areas that are fairly inaccessible or logistically challenging so that they can serve as a nucleus for seeding the surrounding area in the future. And in this review, they termed this a founder stand. And also, Jen Stevens mentioned this yesterday in a session following a recent paper proposing a post-fire management framework. Okay, so there's been a lot of interest in nucleation for post-fire recovery in the system, but there hasn't actually been a lot of empirical work to investigate it. And our question was, does the strategy make sense in pine-dominated and mixed conifer forests in the Western Sierra Nevada? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this system, which might be a small minority, the most important thing to know is that these trees are adapted to fairly frequent low to moderate severity fires, meaning that many trees survive fire to act as seed sources for subsequent generations. The conifer trees here do not have a seed bank and do not resprout, so recruitment really does depend on proximity to a seed tree. And this has been shown empirically, and Ken's presentation earlier demonstrated this on a very widespread scale in these types of systems. There are several shrub species that compete heavily, and it's important for seedlings to get a head start before they're overtopped. So the third and fourth cartoons here show this dynamic where seedlings arriving early to the mineral soil can establish as shrubs start to resprout or seed in. So with wildfires getting larger and more severe, this has resulted in vast regions without seed trees, which compromises regeneration and recovery processes. And with these dynamics, it's not completely obvious that regeneration originating from planted trees can occur in the same way that regeneration might occur just after a disturbance. So we decided to undertake a modest observational study to investigate whether founder type stands would actually be likely to seed the surrounding area. So we asked the question simply of whether reproductive planted stands are associated with seedling establishment outside of the planted stand. And we had two hypotheses. If planted stands are important contributors of seed availability, we would expect to see additional recruitment within dispersal distance of a planted stand. And another hypothesis is that by the time planted trees are reproductive, there's too much competing vegetation for additional cohorts to establish, in which case we'd expect to see seedling occurrence and density reduced by shrub competition. And we did have this directional expectation of competitive rather than facilitative interaction between tree seedlings and shrubs for many of the reasons that Danny mentioned in an earlier presentation. Partially because that's the dominant silvicultural perspective. And also we did think that experimental work on this topic suggests that facilitative processes happen under a pretty narrow range of conditions that probably don't apply in our case. Okay, so anyway, we sampled in 3 areas that were planted about 25 years ago and are now reproductive. Each of them had patches or adjacent areas that were left unplanted due to a research study or where we could discern no environmental reason for the planting boundary. And here you can see these unplanted patches. If you blur your eyes, you can see that they're pretty square. This one definitely looks more square. So so we inferred that these arbitrary boundaries were an appropriate test of this situation. So, the Tahoe National Forest. At the Tahoe National Forest site, the planted area did not overlap any fire perimeters, so we couldn't really say that it's a post-fire situation. It is clearly planted visually and by looking at the Forest Service's database of management. So we thought that it was acceptable for addressing the nucleation question, if not the post-fire question, and it represented only a small fraction of our sites. So in these areas, we surveyed plots in transects that crossed the planted stand boundaries and therefore varied in distance to our focal seed sources, the planted stands. One plot was directly within the planted stand, one was just adjacent to it, and the other 2 were far outside the expected dispersal range. We tried to restrict sampling to high severity areas to try and minimize the background signal of seed rain from non-planted trees, but as you will see, this was not always successful. And at each plot, we characterized the competitive environment, taking into account shrub cover and height measurements, as well as various measurements for each seedling that we found. Right, so what did we find in general? So first of all, I'll focus on ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine seedlings, aggregated here as yellow pine, because they are very difficult to tell apart and have similar patterns in our data. And actually, in fact, no other species was planted in high enough density for us to have kind of a reasonable expectation of assessing seed rain. So most of our analysis did focus on yellow pine seedlings. We used a binomial model to predict whether a yellow pine species would occur in a given plot. And we used a negative binomial model to predict the densities at each plot. And for model selection, we included our hypothesized mechanisms in all of our models. So predictors related to planted or other seed sources and shrub competition. And we included other site predictors if they improved the model fit. We found that yellow pine seedling occurrence was significantly less likely further from the planted stand, suggesting that there is some support for this dispersal limitation hypothesis. So in other words, planted stands seem to be contributing to seedling regeneration. We didn't find that seedling occurrence varied with shrub cover. Seedling densities were marginally negatively associated with shrubs, providing some suggestive but kind of generally inconclusive answers to our competitive impacts hypothesis. So taking a closer look at the planting effect or the distance effect, the figure here shows how seedling occurrence varies based on distance to the planted stand. The black line shows the effect across all plots, and the other lines show variation among all of our transects. And we can see that even within the planted stand itself, so at this 0 distance, there's only about a 65% probability of finding seedling. So this, of course, declines as you move farther away from the planted stand and outside the area where seed rain is expected. Okay, so next, I will show the results from all seedlings, not just those that vastly dominated the planted stand. This was just to assess whether planted stands could change recruitment patterns aside from providing seeds. And so here again, we see a strong effect of being within or adjacent to the planted stand, with the probability of observing a seedling declining as you move away from the planted stand, and the density declining with distance as well. And once again, we find some marginally negative but not completely convincing effects of shrubs in the density model alone, and not with the presence model. So we do find that the density of other natural regeneration, not just our focal seedlings, and I can get into nuances of that a little bit later in the Q&A. We do find that the density of other natural regeneration in the plot was a strong predictor of both seedling presence and density. And so this other natural regeneration consists of seedling saplings and small trees that are too old to reasonably come from the planted stands. So we expect that they came from other large seed trees in the landscape, and were recruited just after the fire. So assuming that these seed trees are still present, it makes sense that the more natural regeneration there is, the more small seedlings there are as well. So yeah, even though we did try to minimize this effect by surveying in high severity areas, this does kind of, it's kind of a testament to the importance of these kinds of trees that we did observe this effect. I think, okay, sorry. Yeah, okay. So in this plot showing density of seedlings across distances from the planted stand, we can see a density of about 3 seedlings directly within the planted stand. Here again at this distance of 0. And then again, slightly declining with distance. So to translate this from our plot measurements to a per acre basis, you would essentially have a density of about 30 trees per acre just outside the planted stand at 10 meters. So this is potentially within the historical range, but it's well below the typical, the historical range of adult trees. But it's well below the typical stocking density for Forest Service stands, which is more in the range of 200 trees per acre for young trees, or maybe 70 trees per acre for mature trees. Okay, so let's talk about what happened with shrubs. So I think that since we did find maybe a marginally significant negative effect of shrub volume on seedling density, this suggests that more research needs to be done, maybe focusing in a little bit more on this question. We were unable to stratify sampling across shrub conditions. So for each distance stratum, we only had about 20 plots. And this kind of made it hard to draw conclusions about shrub effects relative to other factors. And it could be that shrubs simply affect different life stages than the one we were evaluating. We found that even when seedlings were present, they were substantially overtopped by shrubs. So this photo shows some anecdotal evidence. You can barely see the seedling right here underneath this dense shrub overstory. And this chart plotting seedling and shrub heights shows that shrubs are substantially taller than seedlings in all of our locations. So given the effective shrub competition on tree growth found in other literature, it might be the case that even when shrubs do not limit seedling establishment, there might be later implications on the seedling's ability to grow. So to summarize, young planted stands can contribute to forest expansion, but we should probably temper our expectations for how much. And based on these data, shrubs may not be limiting establishment, but might still compromise seedlings' ability to grow and serve as a seed source for further recruitment and forest expansion. So I just wanted to pontificate a little bit about what this means for our session topic, forest recovery. So first I have a hot take, which is that, so planting strategies in California tend to prioritize yellow pine species. They're shade tolerant, so they need a head start, and they're also fairly poor dispersers compared to co-occurring conifers. But planting from a nucleation perspective might require a different approach. So if stand expansion is a management goal, then the extremely slow march of yellow pine recruitment, like shown for our results, just might not cut it. So some better dispersers like firs or incense ears might not be considered desirable from a resilience perspective, but they might have desirable traits from a nucleation perspective. So regardless of your opinion on that, I think that dispersal speed needs to be a key consideration for planting strategies with nucleation or landscape level objectives. So kind of along the same lines here, it's probably important that species in the nucleation planting mix have some amount of shade tolerance and ability to compete with shrubs, because ultimately forest recovery only takes place if trees are able to eventually overtop shrubs. So this again might imply a different species mix than might otherwise be considered desirable, but it should probably be on the table if nucleation planting is the goal. So obviously, I think this is what I mean. The star is supposed to remind me to say that this doesn't really apply in systems where shrub competition is not a significant ecological process. So less hot take, our results also do implicitly highlight the importance of large seed trees in addition to those that are planted. So managing forests to retain those trees is probably still the best thing we can do to promote regeneration and post-fire forest recovery. So with that, I'd like to thank my field crew, my advisors in the lab at UC Davis, and I'd again like to thank Cal Fire and the California Climate Investments Program for funding this research. And thank you for your attention. If there's time for questions, I'm happy to take a few.
Thanks, Tara. I think we do have a question from Jens. Maybe if you can stop sharing, we'll transition to Laura as we're answering this. So he says, great study, Tara. Did you do any aging of the seedlings to enable inferences around establishment dates and how those might match up with past climatic conditions?
Yes and no. So we did age seedlings in order to make that determination of whether they likely could have come from the planted stand. But that was kind of the extent of our use of those of that aging data. We haven't really tied it to anything more refined as to the temporal nature of recruitment.
Okay, thanks. All right. Laura, if you want to queue up your slides, I will introduce you. And yeah, right now. So our next speaker is Laura Marshall from Colorado State University, and she's going to talk about microsite and site level drivers of planted seedling survival and growth. Take it away, Laura.
Great, thank you. As it mentioned, I'm at Colorado State University working with Camille Stevens-Raman and Paula Fornwalt at the Rocky Mountain Research Station on post-fire seedling planting outcomes in the Intermountain West. Specifically, today I'll be looking at microsite versus site level factors as contributing to survival and growth. Now, as everybody I'm sure knows, we have this issue with modern extreme fire leading to very large treeless patches And in these wind dispersed conifers like ponderosa pine that I work with, once you get more than a few hundred meters away from surviving trees, you're not going to have seedlings. In Colorado, this has kind of been characterized by the Hayman fire, which happened in 2002 and was at that time the largest fire in Colorado, which was surpassed at least 4 times, I think, in 2020. But in those areas, they had very large patches with no trees, and even now, almost 20 years on, outside of planting, you see very little natural regeneration. And this is confounded, I guess, by drought and climate change limiting the ability of regeneration and recruitment to occur. In the left side of the screen, we see some modeling work from Kyle Rodman, who's a collaborator on this project, basically showing that in ponderosa pine and Douglas fir in the Front Range, we're going to have decreasing probability of recruitment, as you move forward into mid-century. And some work from Kim Davis, who spoke earlier, you see there's just generally a lack of probability of recruitment moving forward, with fewer chances of good climate that contributes to natural regen. So in the absence of regen, you basically need to have planting. In areas such as the Hayman fire, which is that photo on the left, 20 years on, you're basically not going to see live trees moving into that area without planting going on, and potentially see conversion to grassland, shrubland. Now, this is a kind of planting matrix from Camille Penelope Morgan, looking at a lot of the factors, more site level factors, I'd say, that lead to areas that you'd want to plant and if you want to consider planting. Specifically in what I'll be showing today, I'll be considering aspect as a major kind of site driver, along with what in this matrix is just microsite conditions. So the site I'm considering more is broad scale, likely affecting across an area, while microsite is basically the very small conditions right at the tree contributing to its survival. And there are plenty of other factors that go into post-fire planting in terms of survival growth. But the big ones that somewhat affect this project are species choices. I'll be showing a rather unique site that has 3 different species planted on it. And the general factors they look at there was their presence on the site before the fire. One that I think is getting increasing consideration is whether the species you're planting are likely to survive in the future. And of course, that you're unlikely to see natural regen. And the seed source for these plantings are generally from within the national forest, ideally from as close to the similar elevation and site characteristics as you'll be planting at. But a lot of it really depends on availability. We have this massive need for planting. Just the 2020 fires, blew tons of holes across the Western landscape that they're starting to look at planting in the next few years. And there's a big crunch for production on the nursery side of things. So now I'll talk a little bit about the specific fire that I looked at. This is just a portion of my postdoctoral work, some field work that we did this summer in the Cold Springs fire, which occurred July 2016 near Netherland, Colorado, which is just up the canyon from Boulder. So you're definitely in the WUI. You can see within this fire perimeter, the red line, it abuts right up against this neighborhood. And there were, in fact, 8 homes lost in this fire, which was human caused and basically very fire weather driven. So you just had a lot of high severity patches through here, though it's a relatively small fire compared to, say, the Haven fire and a lot of the 2020 fires. It did have a pretty substantial impact on this small area. So in terms of planting, what we're looking at here is the planting unit, which is oddly shaped because there's a lot of inholdings in this area. You're right up against the neighborhood. And so it's just 92 acres, and it was planted out with ponderosa pine, limber pine, and Douglas fir. A lot more ponderosa pine than the other 2 species, but they did stake 10 trees per stake row with 10 stake rows per species across the area. So we're looking at 100 trees each, at least initially, of these 3 species within this area. And what I did, we came along this summer and fall, and we collected survival growth and very fine scale microsite and site information at all trees and stakes when there wasn't a tree anymore, and added to this 3 seasons of survival data from the ARNF, the National Forest. And of course, you'll see a difference in survival a few years out from planting. These are actually from down in the Hayman, but all these are kind of potential outcomes of planting live tree, dead tree, tree where its shade object fell on it. And you'll also see a pretty strong difference in growth across certain areas. Like on the right, that tree is much taller. Is it a more productive site, or is there some more genetic component? We'll see. But the specific factors that I'll be looking at so far in this project is for site and microsite are basically aspect, which is somewhat similar across larger areas of the project. As we'll show in a minute, there was some variation enough to analyze, while others like elevation and climate, we didn't have fine scale enough data to really find a difference. And then at microsite level, we're getting very down to details, and it's basically factors that are determined by individual seedling placement within that unit. So things that will affect like the very specific microclimate and like water availability at the seedling. Specifically, we'll be looking at shade objects, which generally we defined as shading the roots of the seedling through the afternoon. And then if there's a depression that suggests that water would collect at a seedling. And I'll talk more about that later. So for site level, we're looking at aspect. Here's our planting unit again, this time shaded with the dark gray for north aspects and white for south. And if you look close, you can see orange dots are dead trees and blue dots are living trees. So even just visually, you can see there's likely some relationship there. And for microsite, here's some examples from the unit. We found certain amount of trees were in shade, a decent amount, maybe 30 to 40% were exposed. This unit in particular was planted by volunteers. So they were instructed to plant by shade objects, but they didn't always get it right. And in some cases, there was a change in the shade object that you could tell it had either fallen onto a seedling or it had been taken away by cutting. And we did characterize that and look at just the like 2021 growing increment versus the entire growth as a way to get away from potential changes over time. And here's an example of the depression. As you can see, it doesn't come across in photos very well. It was a relatively subjective measure, just whether water would collect at a seedling, and kind of a good clue is that if there's like lightweight debris present at the seedling that may have flowed there in a monsoonal storm. So now we'll go through results for these like site and microsite characteristics, starting with aspect and height. So this is total height measured in 2021. So for seedlings planted in 2018, that's going on 4 growing seasons. And if you bid it by aspect and species, we did find an effect. This is only looking at live seedlings, because obviously you can't really measure height growth on a dead seedling. I did do an analysis where we included those as like a 0 measurement for just like a 2021 growth increment. And throughout, when I did that, we found the same relationship as with total height, and just much more strongly significant because of a survivor effect. And that effect, basically, as you see here, as a relative % survival, we found much better survival on north slopes across species. But notably for Douglas fir, it was an especially strong effect. I saw on south slopes where the others were somewhat equivalent. Far more Douglas fir trees died than lived, while you see the reverse on north slope for all species. So now to microsite, looking at shading, we did see an effect on height. So shaded seedlings did seem to confer some height advantage at 4 years after planting. And again, if you only look at the 2021 with the dead trees added in, you see the same effect. While so in terms of survival, we did see very strong effect. So shade objects led to greater survival across species. the project. Now, depression is a little bit more questionable. It might just be like a subjective issue, but there's like no really real relationship with height. Maybe a marginally significant relationship with survival. I think this is probably something that's better looked at through a later experimental project. So basically, to conclude, basically across species, we found greater survival on north aspects with shading. Depression might be a possible help, but we really need more info. It was a somewhat subjective measure that was hard to really identify within this project. And we did see greater height on north aspects with shade. And just looking specifically by species, for limber pine, the microsite factor seemed to be relatively important at this location. So more shading and potentially depression, while ponderosa pine followed the overall trends of north aspects and shade being most beneficial for height and survival. While Douglas fir, the aspect seemed to be the strongest effect, where you see almost all Douglas fir trees on south slopes died. Now, why is this all happen? I think soil moisture is probably a major factor. We did take soil moisture measurements, but I don't have the data to share yet, along with some ecophysiological drought testing with a collaborator at RMRS that will give us some idea of drought tolerance between the surviving trees at our site. And with those, I kind of hope to be able to provide some attribution of our observations towards whether soil moisture or other factors are really driving survival here at, terms of planting. And really, with the work here, we noted that, well, microsite is very important along with site overall aspect in determining survival and growth. Later work will probably include whether reburn potential along with shade objects could contribute to greater survival or not. As in other talks, people have talked about the risk for reburning of logs that are providing shelter to seedlings will obviously provide greater fire risk in the future to that seedling. But in terms of at this site and this project, at least, we found relatively consistent results with the literature that shading objects were beneficial to survival. So thank you. My co-authors on this, Paula Fornwell, Camila Stevens-Roman, our field crew, Kevin Zimlinghouse, who's the forester that provided some of the growth data, and we tag for funding.
Great, thanks, Laura. We do have about 8 minutes for questions. So yeah, please chime in if you have a question for Laura. I'll look on the Q&A, but I don't see anything yet. So you can also post through there.
Thanks, Laura. I've got a question for you. What can you say about, do you know anything about, I guess, the seed sources and stuff like that? Because you had mentioned a potential genetic component. I'm just curious if you were able to drum any of that information up from the plantings.
Yeah, seed lot is the best we can get, and that gets us to not very detailed information, unfortunately. I think they all came from the same seed lot, obviously 3 different ones for species. They were all from the Arapaho Roosevelt National Forest, so somewhere nearby, but fortunately either I can't find it or the data doesn't exist now as to where specifically, like which trees or down to a very, a fine enough scale to say something. Obviously you could do a genetic workup on the seedlings out there, but that's a bit outside my experience. So unfortunately, it's just one potential contributing factor that I don't know that much about.
Thanks.
So we have a couple questions coming in. One from Jens. Any plans to do a similar analysis in New Mexico, Laura?
Let's see. Not at the moment. I am working on a larger model project that is just considering survival across Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And that is obviously still in progress. But we don't have the fine scale growth data or tree level microsite data for a lot of these locations that we're working with. And that one will be more focused on larger site level characteristics that you can derive, say, from GIS. This project in particular, we were able to do the field work to get that really fine scale microsite information that is kind of lacking in our broader scale project.
And then we do have one more question from Charlotte Reed. She says, great talk. What ecophysiological variables are you going to be looking at going forward?
In that case, let's see, I've been less involved on that part of the project. Rob Hubbard at RMS, I believe, is the one that will be running those. Yeah, I don't have too many details right at hand right now on that. Just that drought tolerance is a factor that they'll be looking at using some of the needles from trees in shade and out in the open. So tune in next year for for those results.
Hey, any other questions? We have 2 or 3 minutes left. Okay, if not, we'll just hold tight and wait for the next talk.
Well, I got a question just in general for maybe the other speakers too. So we assume that the microsite in these by the logs is different from elsewhere, but I mean, wouldn't it be really relatively easy to put some temperature buttons or soil moisture buttons in the ground to kind of, has anybody done that? Kind of actually look at the temperature difference between on some of these microsites?
Well, we do have some soil moisture measurements that we took at a few times through the summer using hydrosense probes. So we don't have like the long-term in place time series of it, but we will have some direct measurements to say whether soil moisture is potentially contributing to our observed differences in survival and growth. And I'm sure the other folks can speak. I know Matt Hurteau was sticking eye buttons on seedlings. We weren't able to do that on this project though.
Great. Well, I think we'll stop there and transition to the next talk. Thank you so much, Laura.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker, Jeff, maybe you can speak to Byron. He is not with us for the presentation today. So we have a pre-recorded video from Byron and it is about 9 minutes long. Jeff, I'm assuming we wouldn't have any kind of Q&A afterwards since Byron is not with us, right?
Yeah, so I was going to say if we as a group want to talk about the recording, unfortunately, Byron isn't able to make it because it's something like 3 o'clock in the morning where he is.
Great.
He was willing to go to 2, but he couldn't stay up to 3, he said.
That sounds great. Okay, so we'll play this video. It's about 9 minutes long. And then if we want to have a discussion as a group afterwards, great. We have about 10 minutes after the video until Jennifer starts. And I don't want to start Jennifer early because I want to make sure that people who are planning to join right on time for Jennifer's presentation will be able to. So if we don't have any discussion after this video, we may take a quick little 5 to 10 minute break and start Jennifer right on time. Does that sound good, Jeff?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was doing. So
perfect. Yeah, without further ado, I'm going to hit play on this presentation and let me know if you don't get good video or audio.
Before you hit play, I just wanted to let everybody know that Byron Lamont is from Curtin University in Australia. And yeah, he's been studying serotinous conifers for a long time now.
All right, here we go.
Slide 1, Hello from Byron Lamont in Perth, Australia. Since this presentation is scheduled for 2 a.m. our time, I decided it best if I recorded it, although I hope to be awake to answer questions at that time. Here I review how serotiny can help trees survive a drying, increasingly fire-prone climate. The image in the background of the first slide is taken from my 2020 review with colleagues on the evolution of serotiny, and there is a reference list at the end of the presentation. Slide 2. Suitable structures for serotiny to evolve can be traced to 330 million years ago among conifers, with their woody cones that protected wing seeds which can be stored there for some years. Slide 3. Serotiny among pines probably arose about 120 million years ago when forests now experienced crown fires at the start of perhaps the hottest period in the Earth's terrestrial history. Carbon dioxide levels were 3 times what they are now. Oxygen levels were also much higher, and even sodden litter would ignite when hit by lightning. As a result, this time was called the Fiery Cretaceous. Slide 4. Conditions suitable for the evolution of serotiny have varied radically over this time. 4 phases can be recognised since the asteroid hit the Earth 65 million years ago. Serotiny among cypresses increased, then decreased as the Earth's temperature dropped once the Southern Ocean could circulate unimpaired as Australia was no longer attached to the Antarctic. It then rose markedly as the temperature and atmospheric oxygen increased. From 10 million years ago, temperatures, oxygen, carbon dioxide and fire proneness fell, and non-serotinous cypresses speciated strongly into non-fire-prone areas that became more abundant. Gradually, seasonality rather than oxygen levels began to control the incidence of fires. Slide 5. Trees that release their seeds quickly are called weakly serotinous and can co-occur with strongly serotinous species, or the same species can show greater serotiny under hotter, drier conditions. Whether this is phenotypic plasticity or genetically fixed requires translocation field trials, but is invariably a mixture of the two. Slide 6. Trees either survive or are killed when incinerated. Some trees escape crown fire if they do not catch alight in the presence of ground or surface fires, especially under savanna climates. Thus these trees are usually non-serotinous, but here we only deal with trees that ignite in the presence of fire, that is, crown fires. Slide 7. Tree size depends on growing conditions. This can vary locally. Thus the blue trees here received more water and nutrients than the red trees in the same population. These differences are an example of plasticity. The middle trees grew in a hotter, drier climate than the left-hand trees. These differences are an example of genetic adaptation. Slide 8. But the patterns among on-plant seed store can be quite different. Trees under better growing conditions of course produce and store more seeds as they are bigger. But trees under poorer conditions may adapt to store more seeds by increasing their level of serotiny. Typically, fire-killed trees produce and store far more seeds than those that survive fires. Here, I refer to the data on the right. Slide 9. This pattern is confirmed here, where plants growing under xeric conditions have 60% higher degree of serotiny compared with those under mesic conditions. Slide 10. What are some of the demographic implications of varying levels of serotiny? The most obvious is that age range of plants is much greater in the weakly serotinous populations, here those on the left. Note again that this effect can be genetically based or due to growing conditions for a given species. An example is highlighted in pink here. Slide 11. Second, the higher the level of serotiny, the greater is post-fire population size because more seeds are released. This assumes that seed availability limits population size that our work on Banksias certainly does support. Slide 12. The number of interfire recruits depends firstly on how many seeds are released annually, that is the level of serotiny, and secondly on how good interfire recruitment conditions are, that is how effective rainfall is for germination and establishment. Slide 13. Thus, as seasonal drought increases and fire frequency or intensity rises, there will be greater death of interfire recruits, so that genotypes that release fewer seeds into fire will be favoured, and each successive post-fire population will be genetically more serotinous. Slide 14. Imagine that a fire occurs every 25 years that kills all plants and the replacement population takes 10 years to reach maturity, when seed production increases uniformly until the next fire. Seed production will fall gradually as each population is now smaller in the presence of worsening growing conditions. Slide 15. Assuming only non-serotinous genotypes are released into fire, then gradually more genetically serotinous offspring will remain, as the interfire released seeds never produce reproductive adults. Slide 16. Thus, on-plant seed store is controlled by tree age and size, tree density and canopy cover at the population level, and rainfall, nutrient availability, altitude and latitude as they affect temperature at the resource level. These are growing condition effects on the size of the seed store. They operate at the physiological level. Superimposed on this is the rate at which cones open to release their seeds that is unaffected by these factors. Given a particular regime of rainfall, temperature and seasonality, these responses become genetically fixed. Thus, in this figure, the level of serotiny increases as aridity, average temperatures, and restriction of rainfall to winter also increase at any fixed level of the other variables. And matched gradients in resources and population properties have their own seed store serotiny line as on the figure. Slide 17. Our modelling of fire-killed banksia shows that as fire frequency increases, high levels of serotiny lead to greater population growth rates with each fire, as more seeds are stored. Interestingly, there is an optimum level of serotiny that is the result of having stochastic rather than regular fires that makes the model more realistic. Note that when fires are rare, the level of serotiny is also not important. Slide 18. In summary, 1. The number of seeds stored on the tree is a function of both growing conditions and level of serotiny. As serotiny increases, so the seed store at the time of fire is greater. 2. As growing conditions deteriorate and fire frequency and intensity increase due to climate change, the higher the level of serotiny that is present, the greater will be population growth with each fire. Thus, greater serotiny is now adaptive. 3. As interfire recruitment becomes less likely due to decreasing rainfall and higher temperatures, non-serotinous genotypes decrease and serotinous genotypes increase. Thus, greater serotiny is also promoted. 4. Thus, what is desirable adaptively also starts to occur by selection. 5. Unfortunately, there is not enough time for these changes to occur in natural populations, but suitable breeding and selection programs are certainly possible for plantation trees. Translocations of selected genotypes might be practical for some species of particular concern and can reveal the extent of their phenotypic plasticity. Elsewhere, phenotypic plasticity will have to be relied upon. Slide 19. I give the reference list I used for this review here.
All right, I think that is the end of the recording, but I'm excited. I think Byron is able to join us. So Byron, I don't know if you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself, and maybe we can take some questions. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody made their name to be Byron Lamont.
Yeah, Byron, I'm sending you over a little request to unmute and start video. See if any of that works.
Unmute. Oh, am I muted?
There
no,
you
we
are.
can hear you, Byron.
Sorry. Yes. Technology is not my strength. Okay. can you hear me then?
We can.
Oh, that's amazing. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
we just played your recording, as you might have seen, and you know.
Yes, I did. Good. Right. So, was everyone happy with that?
Yeah. Any questions for Byron? I had one. Maybe I can kick it off. So
Right.
sometimes students ask me if classically non-serotinous species would ever adapt in the short term to be, you know, serotinous in the near future.
Well, that's a tricky one, isn't it? It all depends on the vagaries of mutations, and yeah, I mean, if there is the potential for that, I mean, you've got to have certain basic requirements. You know, you've got to be able to store the seeds in some sort of woody structure to start off with. So you've got to have a few of those prerequisites, and then I suppose, yes, with mutation and selection, it is theoretically possible for a non-serotinous species to become serotinous over time. Yeah. Can you see me, by the way, or not?
No, we cannot see you.
Oh, right. Okay. Not worth looking at because I'm in my dressing gown.
I know it's very late or very early where you are.
Yes, very early it is. It's what, 3:12 a.m.
Yeah, I'm impressed you're here with us. Thank you.
It's all right. It's fine. So the conference is going well.
Yeah, we're having a nice special session here.
Good.
Conference is going well.
And I see you managed to fix up the sequence of my slides, and which
yeah,
I
that
wasn't
wasn't me. That was the producers of the conference.
Okay. All right. That's good. It's good. Yeah. Fine.
Okay. Well, we do have 8 minutes before the next talk, so please feel free to ask questions. I'm looking online. There are none from.
Looks like maybe Matt. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. Thanks, Byron, for your talk. It's really interesting to think about these things evolutionarily. And I was thinking maybe there's a flip side to Jeff's question, and the context being here, you know, in Western North America, or certainly in most of North America, we've had a long period of fire exclusion, you know, 100, 150 years. And I wonder, you know, if interrupting a process like that for a long time could potentially select against serotiny in some of the species that we have here.
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. I'm sure that is certainly possible. Of course, it all depends on whether you've got new generations occurring over that 150 years or so. And, you know, if there is interfire establishment, of course, you've got an opportunity for genetic change. So, yes, in the absence of fire, gradually, I'm sure that you would get a loss of serotiny. Particularly if interfire establishment is possible. But because your trees live so long, don't they? And your fire intervals are typically, you know, anything up to 100 years in some places. So that's nothing unusual, perhaps, and may not have given enough time for any genetic change of any note. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about like sand pine, which has, you know, and other serotinous species that have, you know, subspecies or varieties that are non-serotinous almost exclusively and more serotinous. And maybe that was a legacy of past, you know, disruptions in fire regimes.
Indeed, sure.
But Matt, you were going to say something else.
No, yeah, sand pine, or I mean, I think about knobcone pine, and some of the recent work that we did, we found that knobcone pine was expanding pretty significantly in places without fire. So some of the hotter, drier sites at lower elevation. And it does seem like if they're losing serotiny and then fire comes back, you know, they'll potentially be maladapted for future conditions.
Yes.
Yeah, and knobcone's not a super long-lived species compared to some of the the other conifers we have out here. But yeah, thanks for your answer. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And then Byron, we do have another question from Sharon Hood through the question and answer post. She
Fair
says,
enough.
I'm most familiar with Pinus contorta lodgepole serotiny, which becomes serotinous with age. Do you think the increase in frequency, there will be a selection for serotiny to start developing earlier in the tree's life?
Yes, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, that's a phenomenon I'm not really used to in the Australian flora of increasing serotiny with age, but I can understand that happening adaptively. And yes, again, I mean, if there's chance for new generations to occur in response to fire, and fires occurring more frequently, then there will be selection of those that happen to mature quicker in terms of their ability to store seeds. So indeed, there is an opportunity. The problem is that we don't really have very much time, do we, for genetic change, as I say in the talk. It's selection by managers of plantations and so on can certainly, take part in the selection process, but under nature, waiting for things to happen, we don't really have that sort of time, do we, anymore?
Yeah, I know. I like your point where if it's not present in the genetic options currently,
Yeah.
that's going to be.
Yeah. Oh well, unless we're going for genetic engineering or something, I can't see that we'll have opportunity unless we get involved ourselves, and that's not an easy task.
We still have 2 to 3 minutes. If any, yeah, David, go for it.
Tomorrow I give a talk that touches on this issue, and that's the age at which serotinous species produce their first cones.
All right.
As you'll see tomorrow, it's about 10 years old.
Mm.
And so to get back to Matt's point, it's hard, given how much a single cone represents in terms of the allocation of photosynthate. It's going to be hard to get much younger than that to be producing their first cones. They still have to allocate the wood. They have to build their trunk.
Right. Yeah. Certainly, I accept that point. Yeah, just how young can they go? Yeah. Well, our Banksias here, which I'm most familiar with, they rarely start producing cones until they're about 5 years old, and then it just slowly builds up gradually with time, and of course it fluctuates depending on the growing conditions of that season, on just how many cones are supported. Yeah, so it is a slow process indeed.
It can happen. Nurseries will at times apply gibberellic acids, and I've seen black spruce under those conditions produce cones as early as 2 years old, 3 years old.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
progress to see.
Yeah. Oh well, there's opportunities for selection then.
Yes, ultimately.
Okay, I think we're ready to transition to the next talks. Thank you so much for
thanks
joining us. That was a nice surprise.
Thanks for giving me the chance to share my knowledge. Right, bye.
Bye-bye. And then Jen, if you're in the audience and you want to share your screen.
Yeah, can you see that all right?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great.
So let's wait less than a minute and then we'll, oh, now we're ready. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Much less than 1 minute. Hi, I'm Jen Baltzer. I'm with Wilfrid Laurier University and presenting, I guess, repping the boreal a little bit here today. So I'm presenting a paper that we recently published looking at the decline of black spruce in boreal forests in response to a changing fire regime. Okay, so first I'm going to acknowledge my co-authors here. This was a big effort. It was a synthesis of data from across boreal North America. It arose from an NASA Above workshop that was held at Northern Arizona University a few years back. And you can see David there in the picture, all of us pretending to be seedlings here. And lots of folks contributed data and ideas to what I'm about to present. Okay, so just to take us up to the boreal, wildfire is, of course, the main disturbance agent in boreal North America and happens fairly regularly. The fire return interval depends on where you are in North America, but on the heels of a nice talk about serotiny, serotiny is a really important part of regeneration in the boreal. And here we have a black spruce cone closed up. And of course, these cones open following fire and release their seeds onto fresh seed bed. Okay, so although wildfire is a critical part of the North American boreal, what we're seeing in recent years is a real increase in fire activity. And we seem to be, these are headlines from Canada, but we seem to be having year after year of record-breaking fire events. And if you want to look at numbers and not headlines, this is what it looks like for Western North America, with increases in area burned through time across all of these different ecoregions that are depicted here. And so we have this change in fire activity with increasing area burned on an annual basis. And there's good evidence that the frequency and severity of these fires are increasing as well. So what does this mean for post-fire regeneration processes? Well, work by one of my co-authors, Jill Johnstone, showed several years ago, showed the potential implications of short fire return intervals or severe fire on the recovery of black spruce. And black spruce is the most widespread and dominant species, boreal tree species in boreal North America. And so this is our pattern of self-replacement that is really typical in black spruce forests. So these hatched lines are the soil organic layer, which can be quite thick in places throughout the boreal. And so you have a fire that burns through, and then regeneration happens, trees grow, the soil organic layer builds, and this process repeats itself. And so this is the pattern of self-replacement that's really common in this system. But if we have severe fires or short interval fires, this can combust the soil organic layer, leading to different seed beds that smaller seeded species can do very well on compared to the thicker organic seed beds. And these changes are, surprising given the dominance of black spruce throughout the boreal forest for the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. So this pattern of self-replacement has helped black spruce be the dominant species in the system for quite some time. All right, so when we think about boreal North America as a whole, there are lots of different outcomes that we can see if black spruce does not self-replace. And one of them is this pattern that was well documented by Jill and colleagues, where we have black spruce transitioning following severe or short interval fire to aspen. But when you move east of the Rocky Mountains where jack pine occurs, we can also see jack pine coming in and replacing black spruce. And jack pine is a fully serotinous species that reproduces at earlier ages, so has some advantages under these conditions of increased fire activity. And sometimes these stands recruit in really, the very tight stands following fire. And then the most sort of extreme situation is this where we have forests failing to regenerate. And we've seen, lots of evidence of this from other systems in this session and in sessions yesterday, but we're seeing the same kinds of patterns in parts of boreal North America. Okay, so with this study, we were really interested in asking sort of three main questions. And the first of which is, how frequent are state changes in North American boreal forests? The second, can these state changes be predicted with a common set of drivers? So do we consistently see the same site characteristics leading to changes in post-fire regeneration outcomes? And where we do see ecological state change, where we do see compositional change following fire, what are the outcomes? Is that consistent across the North American boreal, or are there patterns that can be inferred? All right. So this is the data set that we compiled. It involves over 1,500 sample plots across 11 ecozones in boreal North America. And so our most westerly sites were over here in the Alaskan interior, and our most easterly sites were in Quebec on the Taiga Shield. And but we covered 11 different ecozones across boreal North America, and this entailed the counting of over 53,000 seedlings. So a big effort by an awful lot of people across a very large area. And to be included as in the data set, at the very least, folks had to have counted on a species basis seedlings, post-fire regeneration. And then to be able to evaluate some of the processes that are, state change or compositional change following fire, as well as the drivers of those processes, we needed information on pre-fire, stand structure and composition, and as well as some environmental characteristics, including fire severity in terms of the combustion of the soil organic layer, as well as the canopy combustion, site drainage conditions, these sorts of variables. So we pulled together this data set, and we were really interested in trying to think about the factors that could contribute to compositional change in the stand. And there are two main factors, of course, one of them being seedling density. So you need to have sufficient seedlings recruiting into the system to replace the adults that are killed in these stand replacing fires. And then you also have to know something about the species composition. So if you have one species that's dominant prior to the fire, and a fire comes through and it loses dominance, even if its density is still there, this can lead to alternate forest outcomes. And so we came up with this sort of schematic of that simplifies things based on the post-fire proportion of the population and changes in stem density. And so if we have a species that is dominant, and we loosely characterize dominance as being greater than 50% of the population. So if it maintains dominance following fire, we can have a couple of outcomes depending on density. The first is self-replacement. So it both maintains dominance and it maintains its density, maintains or increases its density so that the stand self-replaces. The second is that it maintains dominance, but its density reduces. And this can mean a couple of things. It can mean that the system sort of maintains many of its functions, but certainly, colleagues in Eastern North America suggest that this can also be a step toward, a transition, especially near tree line, a transition between taiga forest and tundra systems. So density reduction can sort of be a stepping stone toward loss of resilience in these forested systems. And then we can also have a situation where dominance is lost. And this also can differ depending on stem density. And so if the species in question here, we'll talk about black spruce, if it maintains its densities, maintains or increases densities, but loses dominance, this suggests that other species are also coming into the system at fairly high densities. And the outcome, what this means, really depends on the species in question. So here we have jack pine and black spruce seedlings that recruited at the same time. And I think we can all look at that and sort of guess who the winner might be in this. And this is 1 year later. So this is a 2-year-old jack pine and black spruce. This is a 3-year-old jack pine here. And these are 10-centimeter increments on this stake. So, the growth properties of the competitors coming in are really important for determining the outcomes. But in this system, black spruce is far less competitive than many of the species that might come in its place. And then you can have poor establishment where you have, loss of dominance and also loss of reductions in density. So just really poor establishment of the focal species. And finally, regeneration failure, where there are no seedling recruits for that species. So this is our response variable. And I know that took a little bit of time to walk through, but these are the categories that we're going to be looking at throughout the rest of the talk. So in terms of frequency of state changes, this is our first question: how frequent are state changes in North American boreal forests? And just to orient you here, this is percent of sites. The first category before the hatched line is all ecozones combined. And then we go from west in the Alaskan boreal interior to east in the taiga shield. And the colors correspond with resilience or loss of resilience. And so broadly, the blue colors are what we considered likely maintenance of resilience. And the red and yellow colors are places where we expect resilience is lost in the landscape. And so for conifers combined, we have conifers combined on the left and black spruce on the right. And what we see is a lot of variation in both conifer and black spruce resilience. Tendency toward much higher loss of resilience in western forests compared to eastern forests, and particularly here in the Cordillera regions. A big difference we notice here as well is this really high frequency of density reductions in eastern forests in Quebec and Ontario. And so these are the kinds of situations where we think that, it certainly is possible that this light blue bar could lead to subsequent decreases in resilience if these stands don't have sufficient time before the next fire. In terms of black spruce, the pattern looks a little bit different once we move again east of the Rockies. Here we are into the Western Plains region. This is where we see jack pine starting to come in really importantly and replace black spruce in many places. If you look over here, there was fairly high conifer resilience, but black spruce resilience is the lowest across the board, in the plains, in the Western Plains. And so we see this really, this high importance of a transition between black spruce and jack pine in this region, as well as over here in the eastern parts of North America. Okay, so kind of a west-east divide in terms of the frequency of state changes. And so, overall, fairly high resilience, 73% in conifers, 62% in black spruce. But this conversely means we have more than a third of sites showing loss of resilience for black spruce. And just the takeaway from this is changes are more common in the west than the east. Second, what drives post-fire regeneration outcomes? To address this, we used a random forest approach, and we had a range of variables. Some of these are the variables that I mentioned at the start, so residual organic layer thickness, how much soil organic layer is left following fire, site drainage. We also used some climatic conditions, so climate moisture deficit, both the 30-year normal as well as anomalies in the first 2 years after fire. We had time after fire determined from cookies and cores from the sites, ecozone, just to get a sense of those regional differences, canopy combustion, and basal area of the species or group of interest. And we see some commonalities coming out here. First of all, in both conifer resilience and black spruce resilience, residual organic soil layer thickness is one of the top variables in this analysis, as is site drainage. For black spruce, again, this basal area piece comes in really importantly. So the amount of seed source you have on site is a really important predictor of post-fire regeneration outcomes for this species. And then the last one I want to flag is CMD normal, so our climate moisture deficit, pulled out as a top variable in each of these models as well. And surprisingly, the post-fire climate moisture deficit anomalies did not. And I'm suspicious that has a lot to do with the scale of the study. But what we're picking up on here with this 30-year climate moisture deficit is really the difference between the drier Western forests and the wetter Eastern forests in North America. And so the, sort of long-term droughtiness of the system plays a role in the resilience of the system. And this probably is closely tied in also with residual organic layer thickness. Drier systems will have deeper burning. And what this looks like is this. Here we have just, again, these same categories, self-replacement, density reduction, competition, poor establishment, and regeneration failure plotted, and we have residual soil organic layer thickness for each of those for conifer resilience. Black spruce resilience, we see our self-replacement having occurring at thicker residual organic layers. And we also performed a meta-analysis to account for differences in sample size between studies across North America, and we find the same pattern. So more negative effect sizes means a loss of resilience, and we see that we have this positive relationship between residual soil organic layer thickness and maintenance of resilience. And likewise for climate moisture deficit, sites with lower climate moisture deficit tend to be the sites where we see self-replacement or density reduction, whereas greater climate moisture deficit leads to a higher frequency of these loss of resilience outcomes. The same thing from the meta-analysis, we see this negative relationship with less resilient outcomes corresponding to a greater climate moisture deficit. All right, and so the third goal of the study was to determine what the outcomes of these state changes are. So where we have loss of resilience in Black spruce stands, what do we see coming in after the fact? And is this happening consistently across the continent, or do we see regional patterns? And so we're looking specifically at these yellow, orange, and red categories here. And so what we see happening, and again, we're moving from west to east here, is that there is a lot of regional variation in the outcomes when resilience is lost in these systems. In Western North America, we tend to have the deciduous compositional changes toward deciduous endpoints tend to be more common compared to Eastern North America, where jack pine is by far the most common outcome where Black spruce loses resilience. The deciduous species is dependent on the region. So we have the Cordillera and Shield West areas having much higher propensity for shifting toward birch, and aspen being more important in the Alaskan interior and the Plains West regions. And I'll also draw your attention to these yellow bars, because this is where we have not just regeneration failure of Black spruce, but regeneration failure across the board of all tree species. And this was fairly high, ranging from about 10% up to about 30, 35, or 40% regeneration failure within this category.
Just letting you know, okay. You have about 2 minutes left.
Great. Well, this is my last slide.
So
this is just to sort of sum things up. This is, I guess the outlook under intensified fire regime, and this is what these different stand types might look like, and a regeneration failure outcome, but kind of mapped across that initial sample site area that I showed earlier. And so when we're thinking about when we're thinking about these post-fire regeneration outcomes and building these outcomes into different forecasts, into different models, it's really important to recognize this large regional variation in these regeneration outcomes, and thinking about the kinds of ecosystem functions that these parts of the system may provide moving forward. And with that, I will thank you and take any questions if I have time.
Yeah, we have a minute for questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Jen. I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So I was a little surprised about the density being on the lower end of that CMD range. Like I would have expected, kind of a stepwise, like self-replacement under the lowest CMD, and then decreasing density as it got drier. And I'm just curious, do you think that has anything to do with kind of scale of climate data, or do you think it really is just the other predictor variables you evaluated?
Yeah, I imagine it's probably a combination of the two. I mean, we're working in pretty northern systems, and so the climate data is, there are certainly issues with that. I think probably the scale that climate data represents is pretty coarse, kind of that east-west split. And then some of those other variables that we were looking at probably come into play more in terms of Yeah, differentiating the density reduction versus self-replacement outcomes. And, you know, we see most commonly density reductions in Quebec and Ontario, in these northern forests in Quebec and Ontario. And a lot of, you know, that's again a combination of, and this didn't come out as an important predictor in this analysis, but a combination of fire return interval. So when they have shorter interval fires in those places, black spruce just hasn't had a chance to rebuild its cone bank. And so if you have, yeah, and those density effects can be propagated through time.
All right, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Matt, for the question. That concludes our special session for today. So thank you to all the speakers that joined us today. It will continue with 4 additional talks tomorrow, and then there'll be a short discussion section at the end of that. So I encourage you all to attend. Thank you for everybody that joined us.
Yeah, up next, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern time, is our afternoon plenary featuring keynote speakers Kevin Hires, wildland fire scientist of Tall Timbers Research Station, and Sally Archibald, University of the Whitewater Strand professor at the School of Animal, Plant, and Environmental Sciences. We'll also announce the winners of the AFI Lifetime Achievement Awards. To access the session, use the agenda tab on the left of your screen, click sessions, and click the main session to join. Thanks again to all of our speakers and to Jeff and David for moderating, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, Selma.